The cold of the North Atlantic pressed like an invisible hand against the hull of the RMS Titanic as it moved through the moonlit waters with quiet certainty. Icebergs dotted the distance, glinting like pale ghosts under the silver light, but the ship, largest and most ambitious of its kind, slipped past them with calculated grace. Captain Smith, standing at the bridge with an air of stoic vigilance, had already altered course slightly to avoid a particularly dense field ahead. The night remained cloudless, and the sea, though frigid, was calm. Down below, engines hummed, with the steady persistence of human will, oblivious to fate, indifferent to legend. In the grand salons of first class, champagne flutes shimmered in the light of crystal chandeliers, and music from the ship's orchestra spilled through corridors, like a fine mist. Rose DeWitt Bucata leaned against the rail of the promenade deck, her gloves tucked beneath one elbow, the salt-heavy wind lifting strands of her red hair as she watched the wake fan out behind the ship. Her engagement ring, a cold band of duty, around her finger, reflected faintly in the glass panel beside her. She did not feel triumphant about surviving the iceberg field, as some others did. Instead, there was a disquiet inside her that no safe passage could dispel. Below deck, the third-class compartments throbbed with life, laughter, and the fiddler's bow. Jack Dawson was seated on a bench outside his cabin, sketchbook in hand, as he tried to capture the movement of a small child playing with her older brother. The air smelled of coal, smoke, and metal, of sweat and cabbage soup, of stories too numerous to tell. He turned a page, then another, until he reached the drawing of Rose he'd done days earlier, the one she had commissioned in her suite, wearing nothing but the heart of the ocean and her defiance. They had not spoken much in the last 24 hours. Rose had been summoned to too many dinners, too many strolls with her mother and Cal, too many quiet scoldings that masked threats. But Jack felt it, as surely as he felt the tremor of the engines beneath his feet, that their time was not over. Something unspoken pressed at the edges of the ship's routine. The iceberg had been avoided, yes, but what lay ahead was still veiled. In the radio room, Harold Bride tapped the keys with rhythmic precision, deciphering the distant chatter from other ships. The Carpathia was behind them by a good margin, steaming at a modest pace. The Californian lay still in a field of ice, too cautious to move forward. Titanic was alone in a corridor of its own making, fast and proud. Phillips, beside him, shook his head and leaned forward, brow furrowed. "There's something strange," Bride said, pausing, picking up faint echoes. Its interference, Phillips muttered, perhaps from the northern lights. Bride wasn't convinced. He leaned toward the receiver again and caught something odd, bursts of static, then a staccato pulse. Not Morse. Not exactly. Like a signal, but too erratic to decipher. He wrote it down anyway, on the edge of a weather chart, and tucked it beneath the desk. As night deepened, Rose returned to her stateroom, only to find Cal asleep in an armchair, brandy glass tilted in his hand. Her mother was in bed, her face painted in a thin mask of cold cream and smugness. The events of the past few days had shaken them, but not enough to soften them. Rose walked silently to the wardrobe, retrieved her sketch, folded it carefully, and slid it into the lining of her dress. Then she went to the promenade again, unable to stay confined in velvet and gold. She found Jack already there, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, a look in his eyes that was both restless and serene. "Couldn't sleep either," he said without turning. She stepped closer, letting her hand rest on the rail. The stars above were brighter than they had any right to be. "It should have been a tragedy," she whispered. "We dodged it," he said. "But I don't think we're clear yet." They stood in silence. Far above, the Marconi mast gave a shudder. Below, the firemen shoveled coal into the roaring furnaces. And from the horizon, where sea met sky, a pale flicker bloomed, soft at first, then flaring sharply like a mirror, catching fire. At first, the crew mistook it for a meteor, a trick of light, perhaps even an aurora borealis. But then the flicker grew into a pulsating arc of flame that shot across the sky like a silent storm. Passengers gathered on deck, pointing, murmuring. Then came the sound, low, drawn out, almost guttural, as if the ocean itself had roared. A pressure wave struck the ship moments later, not enough to damage, but enough to rattle windows and halt conversations. From the crow's nest, a frantic voice called down to the bridge. Captain Smith was already at the wheelhouse, binoculars raised, his face pale. "It's a detonation," someone whispered, but no one could tell from where. By morning, the sky was streaked with clouds that had not been there before. Ash fell lightly on the forward deck. The wireless crackled with urgent messages from European coastlines and vessels hundreds of miles south. Something had exploded near the Arctic Circle. Something large enough to cause seismic tremors recorded. As far as New York, a coal mine, a military test. No one knew. But the air smelled different, sharper, electric. By midday, Phillips received a message from the Mauritania. The news was partial, garbled. A Norwegian outpost destroyed. Northern weather stations going dark. Compass interference reported by multiple ships. Bride stared at the message, then at the strange static he had recorded earlier. He felt a chill despite the rising sun. Captain Smith ordered a speed reduction. Titanic, once proud to chase the Atlantic horizon, now moved cautiously. But it wasn't enough. By the third day, they entered a fog like none other, dense and humming, as if laced with static. The ship's instruments began to falter. Compass needles twitched erratically. Clocks lost sync. Electrical surges flickered through the lights at random, and beneath them, the sea began to heat. Rose stood in her cabin, as the lamps dimmed and brightened like breath. Her mother muttered something about poor maintenance. Cal snapped at a steward, but Rose felt it again, that same disquiet. Now sharpened into dread, she found Jack in the lower decks, near the boiler rooms, talking to a stoker who had seen steam rising from the sea itself. Salt was crystallizing on the walls. The heat in certain shafts had become unbearable. "It's the water," Jack said. "It's warming fast. Too fast. Like it's being cooked from below." They brought their concern to Andrews, who listened carefully, but said little. Then he invited them, uncharacteristically, into a private engineering room. There, he unrolled a temperature chart. It showed irregular spikes, sudden changes in pressure and sea salinity. He did not know what it meant, only that it was wrong. The crew became tense. Lifeboats were checked, engines maintained, but the real enemy was invisible. On the fifth night, the fog began to glow. Not brightly, but with a bluish tinge that hovered over the water like a living veil. Passengers gathered on deck to watch, marveling at its beauty, unaware of its cause. Then came the tremors. Gentle at first, then rising like a heartbeat. Jack held Rose's hand as they stood near the stern. They watched as the water ahead bulged, not a wave, but a dome, a lifting of the sea itself. And from beneath it, a sound emerged, deep and tonal, like a horn played in the belly of the earth. Andrews arrived on deck with a telescope and froze mid-step. "This is no weather," he said softly. "Something under the ice has ruptured. A thermal vent, or worse." The fog began to drift toward the ship with intention. Lights blinked out across the upper decks. People began to panic. Rose felt the pressure change in her ears. Jack turned, pulling her down toward the third-class corridors, where he had once run free, but now they were choked with heat and humidity. The air shimmered. Captain Smith gave the order to halt the ship. Engines died with a groan. The wireless, once alive with static and code, fell to silence. Bride turned the dials in vain. The sky above turned the color of bruised steel, and the sea began to breathe. A column of steam erupted 2 miles off the starboard side, followed by a tremor that buckled the hull's frame. It didn't rupture, but creaked violently, sending shockwaves through the deck. Rose stumbled, Jack catching her. The officers shouted commands, trying to maintain order. But there was no enemy to fight, no collision to brace for. It was the sea itself that turned against them. The phenomenon lasted hours. Passengers were gathered to the upper decks. Heat pressed from below. The glow in the fog began to pulse in rhythmic waves. It was Andrews who finally said what others had feared. "We are above a geothermal fissure, one that has opened beneath the Atlantic." The Titanic, unsinkable by ice, had sailed into the jaws of the Earth's fury instead. When the vent beneath them fully ruptured, it did not explode so much as exhale an enormous, steaming breath that rose like a tidal exorcism. The ship groaned as a vertical wave of heat pushed upward, cracking rivets, warping steel. Wood paneling split along corridors. Water tanks burst. Glass shattered in the Café Parisien. But the hull, stubborn and majestic, held. Barely in the aftermath, the air cooled. The fog dissipated, and the ship, battered but afloat, drifted silent in the reddening dawn. The disaster had been averted, not by man's power but by the whim of something older, deeper. Passengers were changed. Some wept openly, others prayed. Some spoke of omens and divine wrath. But beneath it all was the shared silence of those who had seen the veil lift and been allowed to live. Rose, her gown torn and hair soaked with steam, looked out at the calm horizon. Jack stood beside her, his sketchbook low. long gone, his hands burned from helping others below. They said nothing. They needed no words. The Titanic, queen of the ocean, did not sink. But it was no longer the same ship, and neither were they. The sea that had once welcomed the Titanic, with crystalline waves and obedient stillness, now stretched out like a scorched plain, unnaturally placid and filled with the memory of fire. The silence after the rupture was profound, as if the ocean itself had gone into mourning or was drawing breath for something worse. The fog had receded, but the sky was now tinted with an unnatural hue, faintly ochre, like the stale remnants of an eclipse. The passengers wandered the upper decks in a state of quiet disbelief, moving like sleepwalkers beneath the brittle wind. Captain Smith stood beside Thomas Andrews and Chief Engineer Bell, their faces stiff with unspoken calculations. They had not slept. None of them had. The pressure had warped several interior frames, twisted steel stairwells below the waterline, and rendered the compass all but useless. The engines, though intact, refused to start at full capacity without risking further damage to the propulsion shafts. Titanic was afloat but adrift. The wireless room remained mute, the Marconi receiver now completely unresponsive. Phillips had taken apart the coils and realigned the capacitors twice, to no avail. The signal burst recorded by Bride before the rupture had not returned, and the eerie silence in its place was louder than any siren. With no word from the outside world and no visible ships on the horizon, Titanic floated alone in the belly of a changed Atlantic, waiting for a world that might no longer exist as they remembered it. Down in steerage, families clung together, frightened by the smells of sulfur and heat still lingering in the corridor walls. Rumors flared, unchecked volcanoes under the sea, biblical wrath, the awakening of something ancient. Some of the crew, normally stalwart, had begun to pray aloud. Others worked furiously, tending to cracked bulkheads and wounded passengers, their movements mechanical, desperate for distraction. Jack moved between the classes, now granted a kind of informal liberty by the chaos. He had spent the night lifting debris from the galley, helping a steward evacuate a burned laundry room, and carrying a child to the infirmary after a pipe burst above her bunk. His clothes were filthy, his fingers black with ash and copper oxide, but his eyes were clear, focused. In the crisis, he had become something elemental, present, undistracted, alive. He knew fear, but he let it pass through him, replaced by the sharp edge of duty. Rose found him beside the second-class library, using a crowbar to wedge open a swollen door. She watched for a moment, the way he gritted his teeth and pressed his weight into the metal, until the door gave with a screech and revealed a corridor full of soot and fallen plaster. He looked up, breathless. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but her posture was straight. "They're saying the heat rose from under the seabed," she said. He nodded, leaning on the crowbar. "Some kind of vent, maybe deeper than anyone's ever seen. And it could happen again." Didn't answer. Instead, he stepped past her and reached for her hand, fingers rough but steady. "Come with me," he said. "There's something I want to show you." They moved through the quiet ship, like two shadows in a cathedral. The great halls were no longer grand, just wounded chambers filled with smoke and memory. They passed through second class and then lower, down into the service accessways Andrews had once shown Jack when he sketched the ship. There, in a storage room near the coal feed, lay a window that no passenger was meant to see. Jack cleaned the glass with his sleeve and gestured for her to look. Rose leaned down and peered into the water. The sea was clear now, strangely so, as though the heat had burned away the cold. Through the glass, she saw strange shaped pillars of basalt rising from the depths, their sides glistening with molten shimmer. Fissures pulsed with faint red light, like veins in a living thing. "The earth is changing," Jack said quietly. She touched the glass and drew back quickly. It was hot to the touch. "Do you think we'll make it back?" He looked up at her and smiled faintly. "I don't think we'll go back. I think we'll go forward. Wherever forward ends up being. By late afternoon, the captain convened the senior officers. In the officers' mess, the consensus was grim. The ship could not travel at full speed. Navigation was unreliable. Wireless contact had ceased. Provisions were intact, but fresh water was being monitored carefully due to the surge in temperature. Their best option was to drift south with the current and hope to intersect a known shipping lane. Caledon Hockley stormed into the meeting uninvited, demanding a private rescue, an alternative route, leverage. He waved banknotes, offered bribes, screamed about lawsuits, but no one listened. The old world of entitlement had lost its voice in the new one of fire and silence. He stormed out, red-faced and alone, and no one followed him. In the hours that followed, Andrews and Bell coordinated repairs below, working with stokers and engineers to realign the propulsion system to half speed. Jack and several other able-bodied passengers helped relay messages and clear debris. Rose, against all protests, assisted the infirmary staff, tending to burned hands and bruised limbs, finding focus in the pain of others. That night, as the stars emerged again, brighter and closer than before, the sea began to shift. From the starboard deck, Rose and Jack saw ether water dimpling like fabric, forming ripples without wind. Then came the sound again, distant and deep, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. This time, however, the sea did not rise. It peeled open. A chasm, miles long and glowing faintly, split the ocean to the east. Water flowed into it like a drain, forming whirlpools that churned without visible cause. The ship was too far to be pulled in, but not far enough to escape the resonance. Titanic rocked, metal groaning in protest. Waves formed and then dissolved without cresting. The glow beneath flickered, like lightning in slow motion. Jack grabbed the rail to steady himself. Rose fell against him, and together they watched as something rose from the center of the chasm, a tower of rock, or metal, or both. Smooth, black, and strangely symmetrical. It emerged for mere minutes, then slipped beneath again, vanishing, as though swallowed by thought. "Did you see it?" she whispered. He nodded. "We weren't meant to, but we did." Whatever had ruptured beneath the sea had unearthed something not born of lava or steam. There was geometry to it, intent. Not man-made, but deliberate. A shape that suggested knowledge. And then the water calmed. The sky lightened. The wind resumed. And for the first time in days, the ship felt again like it was on an ocean, and not in a dream. The days that followed passed slowly. Titanic limped forward under half speed, the fog and strange air lifting little by little. On the seventh day, a ship appeared on the horizons. Small, distant, but real. The Olympic wireless contact had been restored in brief pulses, and the Titanic had drifted south just far enough to be seen. Cheers broke out. Flares were launched. Flags waved. Titanic's passengers leaned over the rails in tears. Some fell to their knees. Others simply stood in place, too stunned to react. The rendezvous was slow, but steady. Within hours, they were transferring telegrams, messages, and in time, the Olympic did not have the capacity to rescue them all, but it provided direction, guidance, and the knowledge that they were not alone. By the 12th day, Titanic reached port in Halifax, Canada, scarred but intact. The press was waiting, but the stories they were given did not align. The official reports spoke of a freak thermal event, a subsea rupture. Scientific teams debated the nature of the phenomenon. Government bodies dismissed talk of structures beneath the sea as hysteria induced by stress. And yet, the passengers remembered. Some left the ship and never spoke of it again. Others formed groups, societies, kept sketches, tried to map the strange geometry they had seen in the water. Phillips and Bright both left the service. Captain Smith retired quietly, his logbook for those days sealed by the British Admiralty. Rose disappeared from the public eye. Her engagement to Caledon Hockley was quietly dissolved. Her mother never forgave her, though she never spoke of it. Aloud, Jack and Rose found a boarding house in Nova Scotia, away from questions and wealth, and they lived simply. He painted, she studied natural history. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of dawn, they would look to the sea and speak in whispers about the light beneath. They never married, never needed to. Their bond had been forged in steam and flame, in the breath of a world that almost ended but didn't. And years later, when new expeditions were launched to the depths near where the Titanic had drifted, satellites captured anomalies in the seabed patterns, indentations, and heat signatures that puzzled even the most seasoned geologists. But by then, the world had moved on. Only those who had been aboard knew. The Titanic never sank, but it still passed through a death of sorts. And those who survived were reborn, not by the cold grip of an iceberg, but by the fire beneath the sea. The winter that followed their return was unusually long in Halifax. Snow began to fall in early November and blanketed the coastline with an almost otherworldly stillness. Jack and Rose took up residence in a modest stone house overlooking the harbor, its walls stained with sea wind and history. The world beyond their windows moved on, faster now, noisier. The papers churned out stories about political scandals, rising tensions in Europe, the achievements of industry. But beneath it all, a silent current ran through the minds of those who had stood on the deck of the Titanic and seen the sea split open. They rarely spoke of it, except to one another. In the hush of early morning, or the long blue light of dusk, Rose would sit by the fireplace, her knees tucked to her chest, as Jack worked quietly at his easel. His paintings had changed. They were no longer portraits of parlor girls or vignettes of Parisian streets. Now, his canvases held forms that were geometric and vast suggestions of structures submerged beneath liquid veils, patterns that hinted at intelligence and fear. Curators from New York had begun to take notice. One of his paintings was even featured in a small gallery under the title Echoes Below. Rose, too, had found purpose. She had always been observant, curious beneath the layers of silken etiquette forced upon her. Now she read books on geology and seafloor tectonics, subscribing to obscure journals from Norway and Iceland, piecing together fragments of data that suggested volcanic activity under the Arctic Sea had increased in frequency since the Titanic's journey. She wrote under a pseudonym. Her essays speculating that the Atlantic seabed might hold more than just magma and pressure, a hidden structure, perhaps created long before humans mapped the stars. No one took her seriously. But she wasn't writing to be believed. She was writing to remember. Back in London, Caledon Hockley resumed his life with brutal efficiency. He remarried within the year to the daughter of a shipping magnate, his public image undisturbed by the unraveling of his engagement to Rose. Yet those who knew him closely remarked on a shift in temperament, more paranoid, quicker to anger, more prone to retreating into silence. On several occasions, he summoned journalists to his estate only to have them escorted off the grounds within minutes. He was seen pacing the halls at night, muttering about shapes in the water, the way the stars had looked that night above the fog. In time, he lost control of his holdings and withdrew from public life altogether. In Belfast, Thomas Andrews returned a changed man, lauded as a hero for his engineering. During the Titanic's ordeal, he refused the accolades. He spent the remainder of his career quietly working on ship safety reforms, but never again set foot aboard another vessel. When asked about that night, he would only say that he had seen the ocean breathe, and no one asked further. He died in 1925. His journals sealed by the Harland and Wolff Company and never made public. As years passed, Titanic herself remained a paradox. She had returned, battered but afloat, the ship that survived, not because of man's arrogance, but in spite of it. She was towed to dry dock, her hull inspected by engineers who found warping and fractures that defied conventional explanation. Sections of the hull had been subtly magnetized. Others carried chemical signatures inconsistent with any known material. One report claimed there were traces of an unidentified metallic compound embedded in the lower keelbutt. That report vanished shortly after it was filed. Rather than scrap her, Titanic was quietly decommissioned and left moored at Southampton for a time. Her name removed from registries and her decks sealed. Some believed she would be sold for parts. Others thought she would be restored. But neither occurred. In 1914, as the shadow of war crept over Europe, she was quietly scuttled under military order, towed out and sunk in a restricted zone. No ceremony, no plaques, only silence. The world had grown afraid of what she had seen, and what she might still contain. Back in Halifax, the rhythm of life slowed. Jack's health began to fade in the early 1930s. Years of working in damp conditions, inhaling coal, dust and smoke, had left him with persistent coughing fits. He never complained. He still painted, though more slowly, his lines less certain. Rose remained beside him, steady and warm. They never lived lavishly, but they never lacked. When the Great Depression swept across the continent, Rose sold only one painting, Jack's rendering of the tower that had risen from the sea, surrounded by concentric ripples of light. A scholar from New York purchased it for a sum that kept them fed for years. By the fire one winter night, Jack asked her what she thought it had all meant. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, "I think we saw the skin of the world crack, just for a moment. And it reminded us we're not in control." He smiled at that. Even then, his hands still shook with the tremble of the Atlantic. When Jack passed in his sleep in 1936, Rose buried him beneath a tree overlooking the same harbor where the fog had once seemed alive. She carved the headstone herself with a phrase they'd once whispered on the deck of a burning ship, still afloat, even in the fire. She lived many years after that, under different names, traveling across the coasts of Europe and America, never settling for long. She corresponded with geologists and oceanographers, using aliases, always asking the same quiet question. Has it happened again? Were there tremors? Was the sea behaving differently? By 1953, she was living under the name Rose Calvert in San Diego, keeping a collection of notebooks, sketches, and strange maps she had assembled over decades. They were her private memory, stitched together by intuition and the thread of something that had never left her. Her granddaughter once found her staring into the Pacific, whispering in a language she didn't recognize long, vowel-heavy syllables that Rose could never explain. She said they came to her in dreams, from beneath the waves. In her final days, she returned briefly to the Titanic in her mind. Not the voyage, not the glittering decks, or the champagne, but that moment when the sea opened and something immense stirred in the deep. She remembered standing beside Jack, feeling the deck tremble, hearing the hornless sound that no human throat could make. She remembered the calm that followed, the heat in the water, and the way the stars looked impossibly close. She died with her eyes open, looking at a painting Jack had made, the one of her, not nude, but dressed in a simple linen gown, standing on a shore that didn't exist, her hair windswept, a tower of black stone rising behind her in the surf. Years later, a deep-sea expedition near the mid-Atlantic ridge recorded strange seismic activity. A drone captured footage of fissures wider than the Grand Canyon, glowing with soft light, surrounded by structures too symmetrical to be natural. But the footage was lost in a magnetic surge. The ship's navigation was scrambled. The report never published. The men on that expedition returned, silent and pale. And yet, here and there, someone remembers. In sketchbooks, in dreams, in the quiet moments before sleep. The ocean has not forgotten what it revealed. Titanic was never meant to sink, but perhaps, just once, it was meant to bear witness. And those who survived it did not escape death, so much as they were marked by something larger, something primordial, something waiting. There are places in the sea, still, where the water is too warm, where compasses spin and time ticks strangely, where no birds fly and the silence feels too complete. Sailors speak of it in whispers, calling it the threshold. Scientists dismiss it as folklore, but the sea knows. It remembers the queen of the ocean, and the night she passed through fire and came out the other side, not as legend, but as warning. And in the deepest parts of the sea, beneath the layers of current and crust, something ancient waits still, listening for another hull, another heartbeat. Another witness. The last entry in Rose's personal notebook was dated April 10, 1982. Written in her unshaken hand, in the margin of a yellowed map depicting tectonic seams between Iceland and the mid-Atlantic ridge. A brief note, almost a whisper. They've found it again. Coordinates match. Activity rising. We weren't imagining it. It sleeps, but it remembers. She had been living in quiet obscurity in California under her chosen name, Rose Calvert. Her home, modest and filled with houseplants and old books, overlooked a bay that glimmered cold and silver each morning. She had long since destroyed most of the official documents, tying her to her former life. The DeWitt Bukater name existed, now only in paper archives and fading photographs. No heirs were known, no surviving witnesses came forward. The world had long accepted the official version of the Titanic's voyage, a near miss with an iceberg, an unknown thermal event, and the miraculous survival of a ship declared unsinkable. But Rose had never accepted silence as truth. In her final years, she began corresponding with a marine geophysicist named Daniel Havers, a quiet and methodical man who had stumbled upon seismic patterns along the mid-Atlantic ridge that defied all models. His research had been buried under a stack of naval denials, budget obfuscation, and interference from defense contractors. But he knew what he'd found. And when he received a letter from a woman claiming to have seen something rise from the ocean 70 years earlier, he listened. They wrote often. At first, she gave him only fragments, always cautious. But in time, she began to share more drawings, recollections, even a faded copy of Jack's rendering of the structure they had seen rising from the sea. Daniel was skeptical until he compared it with a sonar anomaly captured by a French submarine 3 years earlier. The patterns match: concentric rings, a spire, consistent elevation and geometry beneath thousands of feet of seawater and basalt. He asked to meet her. She declined, not out of mistrust, but because she feared what it would mean to return to it all. She had made peace, in a way, and wanted to leave the waking of such things to younger, braver hearts. After her passing, Daniel received a small package, marked only with her initials. Inside was her final notebook, a series of watercolors depicting the sea splitting in fire, and a letter. In it, she wrote of her belief that what they had seen was not just a geological anomaly, or even an alien structure, but something much older. Something that had waited long before man first stood upright. long before sails kissed the wind. A mechanism, she called it, though not one made by hands. A wound that healed only slowly. A gate, maybe, or a scar. Daniel was never able to verify everything she claimed, but he took her final coordinates and began planning an expedition funded in secret. Not by governments or universities, but by private patrons who had also seen strange things, pilots who watched stars flicker in unnatural patterns, divers who returned from silent trenches, unable to speak. These were the inheritors of Titanic's survivors, whether they knew it or not. In 1985, Daniel's vessel, the Icarus, departed from Reykjavik under the guise of a geological survey. The team consisted of geologists, oceanographers, and one aging cryptographer who claimed to have seen similar shapes etched into stone tablets from Malta and Non-Madel. They were cautious, precise. They did not dare disturb the site, only observe, measure, record. What they found was more than they had prepared for. The chasm Rose had described was there, its edges lined with basalt columns, arranged too symmetrically to be natural. The spire, thought to be a trick of steam and pressure, was real, rising a full 80 meters from the floor, like an obsidian needle. Its surface shimmered in ways that no known material should underwater. Instruments failed at a certain proximity. Divers experienced hallucinations. The Icarus lost power more than once, though no mechanical fault could be found. When they returned to the surface after 8 days, every member of the crew was changed. Back on land, Daniel attempted to publish a preliminary report. The paper was intercepted, reclassified, and eventually discredited. He was labeled eccentric, ostracized by the academic community. But he didn't stop. He believed not because of what they found, but because of what they hadn't. There was no wreckage, no evidence that the sea had ever collapsed in on itself. The anomaly wasn't active, but it wasn't inert either. It waited. Years passed. Technology improved. More probes were sent. Some returned, others didn't. The official line was that deep-sea pressure and volcanic gas emissions caused instrument failure. But Daniel knew better. He grew older, more isolated, clinging to Rose's letters like scripture. One day, in a letter never published, he wrote, "I do not believe the Titanic was spared by luck. I believe it was chosen. Or rather, that its presence at the threshold was observed, tested, and allowed to pass." A conversation was had between the sea and the steel, between what lies beneath and what floats above. And for reasons unknown to us, we were not silenced. In 1997, the year the world would once again be captivated by a dramatized retelling of the Titanic's voyage, a diver working off the coast of Newfoundland reported a strange signal echoing through his equipment. Low frequency, repetitive. Not Morse, not sonar, something older, a call. He surfaced, frantic and trembling, and refused to dive again. Meanwhile, in a private archive in California, Rose's sketch of the tower remained sealed in a vault. Her granddaughter had tried to sell it once, but had been approached by a man in a gray suit who advised, very gently, that it would be best if the drawing remained private. She never spoke of it again. But on her 50th birthday, she received a small pendant in the Mela stone of deep blue set in a brass frame, shaped like a spiral. There was no note, only a name she recognized from childhood. Jack. Far from any port, beneath waters not marked on most charts, something ancient still lay in the dark. Not dead, not forgotten. The patterns on the seafloor now appear in dream journals across the globe, patients reporting shapes they have never seen. In waking life, always described the same. A tower that breathes, a chasm that hums, a name that cannot be spoken. Perhaps it was always there. Perhaps we only glimpsed it once because a ship of impossible scale dared to pass too close. The Titanic never met the iceberg that night, but it met something else. Something deeper than water, older than ice. And though it did not sink, it did not emerge untouched. The story did not end in drowning, or cold, or despair. It ended in awe, in terror, in reverence. A reminder that the ocean does not only hide death, it hides memory, intention, secrets. And somewhere, at the edge of sleep, where sound becomes pressure and memory becomes water, it waits for the next witness. Another ship, another soul willing to listen. To feel the fire in the sea, and to understand what it means to be seen by the deep. In the spring of 2022, an oceanographer named Eliza Wren, professor at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, sat in front of a wall of sonar scans, lit with the bluish hum of filtered light. The data in front of her was not new, it had been collected nearly 2 years earlier by by an autonomous underwater vehicle operating off the southern flank of the mid-Atlantic ridge, but it had taken this long to decrypt, correct, and render. For weeks, the analysis team believed the imaging to be corrupted. Layers of the seabed appeared to ripple with regularity, almost like patterned skin. Columns rose from sediment, like chimneys from a buried cathedral. And in the center of one rendered scan was a spirous smooth, shadowed shape, protruding from a fold in the earth. Seemingly untouched by time or tide. Eliza leaned in, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The tower was not large compared to some natural rock formations, but it was precise. No jagged edges, no fracture lines from tectonic shifting, no erosion marks from current or sediment drag. Its surface reflected sonar in uneven pulses, as if its material was rejecting definition. Her hands hovered over the controls as she layered the sonar data with older bathymetric maps. The anomaly was not new. It had been present in 1985, and faint traces of it existed as far back as 1912, when early echo-sounding experiments had recorded distortions in that region, but failed to interpret them. For hours, she sat in silence, watching the shape appear and disappear under different filters, as if it was winking at her from beneath the waves. Later that night, she pulled a book from her office shelf, a leather-bound journal donated years earlier by the estate of Dr. Daniel Hack. It was rarely touched. Most regarded it as a curiosity, the final work of a brilliant mind that had slipped into speculation. But she had read it once before and remembered a phrase that now rang in her mind with the weight of prophecy. A conversation was had between the sea and the steel. She flipped through the pages until she found his sketch of the spire. The match was undeniable. There, in a footnote, was a name she had never researched: Rose Calvert. Beneath it, in faded ink, a cryptic reference to the RMS Titanic, not as tragedy, but as witness. Eliza hesitated, then opened a secure research terminal and began to dig. The official records stated that Rose Calvert had been a fictional invention, created for dramatic effect in James Cameron's film, based loosely on survivor testimonies. But something didn't add up. No birth records matched. No death certificate. And yet, a woman by that name had left a box of personal belongings to an anonymous collector in California, now preserved in an obscure library archive. Within days, Eliza booked a flight. The archive itself sat hidden behind a university library, catalogued poorly and seldom visited. But the curator, an older man with a collection of pins on his tweed vest, recognized the name immediately. Most people assume she was an actress from that movie, he said. But she wasn't. She was real eccentric, brilliant, secretive. This way, he led her to a table where a single box had been pulled from the vault. Inside was a collection of hand-bound journals, each marked only by month and year, spanning decades. The first dated back to May 1912. Elisa opened it gently, the pages crackling, like leaves, with inward drawings of the sea, of a ship, of a boy's face, rendered with aching precision. She turned the pages with growing awe. There were mathematical notations, sonar sketches, drawn by hand, even lines of what appeared to be ancient script, copied carefully from a dream, she supposed. She stopped at one passage. Written in careful script: "The night the sea opened, we saw not just pressure or light or magma. We saw memory. We saw what the earth carries inside itself, hidden beneath water and rock, waiting not to destroy us, but to remind us that we are not the beginning." Eliza sat back in her chair, heart pounding. Back at Woods Hole, she began assembling a new team. Quietly, without publishing, she contacted sonar engineers, deep-sea submersible pilots, linguists. She reached out to a friend in Icelandic volcanology and her former classmate, now working for NOAA. Each one she selected for their discretion as much as their expertise. She called the mission Threshold 2, but only in personal notes. Officially, it was a geological survey of the Mars 17 zone. On September 3, 2023, the vessel Echo Wake departed the Azores with minimal press, carrying a crew of 11 and one prototype manned submersible named Calypso's Eye. Its mission: to descend to the coordinates Daniel Havers had once marked, guided now by Eliza's refined sonar path. The waters were calm, unnaturally so. There were no storms reported within 1,000 miles. Migratory patterns in the region had changed, noted only in passing by local fishermen. The ocean was waiting. On the 5th day, they reached the site. The submersible descended with Eliza and two others: Rajiv Patel, sonar engineer, and Greta Van Huren, a cryptologist who had worked on ancient symbology in deep-sea ruins off the coast of Japan. They moved past layers of sediment, old coral, dead zones where nothing moved. And then they found it. The spire. It was darker than they expected. Not black, but the absence of lighter material that consumed brightness like ink in the sea. It rose from the seabed in utter silence, surrounded by concentric rings of smooth stone that bore faint carvings, as if even the sea had failed to erase them. Rajiv focused the sonar, his screen flickering in a rhythmic loop. "It's echoing us," he said, "matching our pulses." Eliza watched, eyes wide. No response, just reflection. "No," said Greta, her voice quiet. "Resonance. It's harmonic." The carvings were unlike any known language. Some resembled cuneiform, others spirals and keys. Greta traced them on a digital tablet and began comparing them to ancient artifacts. They were patterns of invocation, she said. Not communication, not warning. It's like it's meant to be remembered. As the submersible drifted closer, the base of the spire emitted a low-frequency hum. Lights dimmed. Instruments reset. Eliza's headset crackled with static, then went quiet. For a full minute, they heard nothing but the quiet beat of their hearts. Then, from beneath the tower, the seabed shifted. Not a quake, a rise. The spire lifted slightly, no more than half a meter, and the rings around it glowed faintly, like coals stirred in ash. A pulse spread outward, measured, slow. The submersible rocked gently, as if caught in the exhalation of a god. And in the silence that followed, Eliza remembered a line she had read in Rose's journal, a line now carved somewhere on the stone. Below them, "It does not want worship, it wants witness." They surfaced in silence. Back on the Echo wake, they shared only fragments with the crew. No footage could be played. The recording devices had been scrambled. But Eliza knew this was no failure. It had always been this way. The sea allowed you only what you were willing to see. When they returned to Woods Hole, they filed their report under geological phenomena. Internally, though, the team continued to meet. They began translating the carvings. Patterns emerged. Not words, not language, but stories. Memories encoded in vibration, temperature, magnetic flow. A history not written but shaped, imprinted on the floor of the sea like grooves on a vinyl record waiting to be read. They weren't the first to find it, and they wouldn't be the last. Eliza returned to the archive months later, standing again before Rose's journals. She opened the one labeled October 1951 and read the final line. Scrawled in ink, "One day someone else will hear the breath beneath the waves and know it isn't the sea." And she did. She closed the book, placed it gently back in its cradle, and stepped out into the sun. The ocean was calm, the sky bright, but beneath her feet, the world waited. And the Titanic, wherever her bones lay scrapped, sealed, or forgotten, remained. Not just a ship, but a testament. The first witness, not of man's triumph, not of tragedy, but of something vaster, older than memory, more patient than time, and far from done. The second expedition launched in late 2025 under the auspices of a newly formed private research coalition called Lemurian, composed of anonymous investors, rogue academics, and at least one former NASA engineer who had quietly left the agency after filing a confidential report on unidentified deep ocean magnetic anomalies. The official story described the mission as a joint venture in seafloor mapping. But to those aboard the vessel, Argos-long and steel-clad with no national flag, the true objective was clear: descend deeper, stay longer, and if possible, initiate contact. The ocean had grown stranger in the years since Echo Wake's mission. Currents shifted unpredictably in the Ma-17 region. Whale migration ceased in the surrounding quadrants. Subsurface temperatures fluctuated without volcanic origin, and tectonic sensors began registering harmonic vibrations and possible sequences, too precise to be random. Naval authorities attributed the anomalies to new submarine technologies. NOAA claimed underwater landslides. But those who studied the scans knew better. At the helm of the Argos stood Eliza Wren once more, now graying and gaunter. Her eyes were sharper than ever, lined with sleepless conviction. She no longer spoke in terms of research or theory. She spoke in terms of memory and faith. Not in anything divine, but in the truth that had haunted her since the first time she read Rose Calvert's words. It does not want worship, it wants witness. She had not returned to academia. She had not given another public lecture. Instead, she had immersed herself in the half-life of the ocean's secret, reading fragments from shiplogs that had vanished from archives, recording the accounts of sailors who spoke in riddles after returning from waters where no ships should be. Each testimony, each blurred photograph, each scratchy sonar image built upon the same pattern. The sea was not inert. It was intelligent, or perhaps more accurately, inhabited by intelligence. Not alien in the way science fiction dreamed, but native, ancient, not born of stars, but of pressure and time, something that had always been there. Beneath the weight of water and myth, the Argos carried with it a second-generation version of Calypso's eye, now equipped with resonance field sensors, audio dampeners, and a new prototype, a harmonic transmitter capable of sending nonverbal pulses, mimicking those detected in the first mission. It was built to listen, and now, to respond. They reached the coordinates on the 10th day. The sea above was black glass. The stars were sharp and silent. No storms, no birds. The descent was smooth, almost suspiciously so. At 9,000 feet, the light died entirely. The temperature dropped 6 degrees in minutes. And then, as before, the sonar began to flutter. Not erratically, rhythmically. The spire waited below, unchanged, impossibly intact. Around it, the concentric rings glowed faintly soft amber pulses, like the breath of something sleeping. But this time, there was movement. Eliza's heart stilled. Just outside the furthest ring, a shape moved slow, deliberate, massive, not mechanical, not fish or squid. Something smooth and coiled, with a tail like a feathered current and a head that turned without eyes. It moved with quiet purpose, gliding through the water like smoke, touching the edge of the ring, and then vanishing in a spiral downward. They had never considered guardians. The transmitter powered on. The submersible released its first harmonic pulse, mimicking the vibration pattern recorded during Echo Wake's descent. For 60 seconds, nothing. Changed. Then the tower sang. It was not a sound, not exactly, more a presence. The water around them thrummed in counterpulse. The lights of the rings intensified, shifting in hue from amber to blue, to violet, to an indescribable shade that the crew later claimed was a color you felt in your bones more than saw. The sub's cameras began to record vertical shifts in the spire's alignment, almost as if it was breathing, and then the carvings lit up. Not chemically, not from bioluminescence, but from within. Every groove, every spiral, every marked rose, had once sketched by hand, now glowed with a soft, deliberate light. The language was alive, responsive. Greta, watching from the surface via telemetry, gasped as the carvings began to change. Not transform, but rearrange, like a sentence rewriting itself in real time. And then came the pressure. The ocean itself pushed inward. Not crushing, but encompassing. Every human aboard felt it not in their lungs, but in their minds. A pulling, a request. And Eliza understood it was asking to be remembered, to be carried, to be known again by those who had forgotten. Not a threat, a warning, a promise. They activated the transmitter again. This time with a series of harmonics derived from Rose's notes, using mathematical ratios aligned with the carving's geometry. As the pulse traveled outward, the spire released a flash of deep blue light that illuminated the trench for miles. And then the sea fell still. In the weeks that followed, data from the mission was parsed in silence. Lemurian's funders received encrypted transmissions that would never be leaked. The crew, bound by contract and something deeper, something more sacred, chose anonymity. Not out of fear, but reverence. Eliza never returned to the site. She didn't need to. What they had seen was enough. She spent the rest of her years compiling everything. Rose's journals, Daniel Havers's manuscripts, her own logs, the sonar scans, the harmonic patterns, the shifting glyphsal into a codex bound in metal and sealed in a chamber beneath the Oceanographic Institute. She called it the Archive of Witness. On her deathbed, she left a simple instruction: let it rest until it calls again. But the ocean never really rests. In the decade that followed, strange reports began to surface: cargo ships vanishing without wreckage, planes veering off course near the Atlantic's heart, instruments failing in perfectly clear weather. Not frequently, not violently, just enough to remind the careful observer that the threshold had not closed. In 2043, a small island near the Azores rose by 10 feet, without volcanic cores. Divers discovered what appeared to be paved stones beneath its southern bay, arranged in patterns too intricate for chance. And a boy 7 years old, born in Reykjavik to a marine biologist, began to speak in his sleep. His words were not Icelandic, not any known language. But when his father recorded the sounds and ran them through harmonic spectrogram analysis, they matched the spire's pulse from the 2025 mission almost exactly. He had never been to sea. No, One could explain it. One night, years later, the boy sat alone on a beach and began drawing spirals in the sand. When asked what they meant, he looked up and said, simply, "It's waking up, and so the truth endures. Hidden not in the past, but in the future. Past not in books, but in the marrow of those who listened. Those who saw the sea part and the old light rise. Titanic did not sink, but it crossed a boundary none could name, and those who came after us, Jack, Eliza, Danielle, even a child born generations later did not return from that. Knowledge unchanged out they bore witness. They carried the story, not of a ship that defied fate, but of a sea that remembered, and still does, even now." In the year 2071, nearly a century and a half after Titanic's journey, the world above the waves had shifted in ways no one aboard her maiden voyage could have predicted. Cities floated on oceans now, built of carbon threads and resin. Managed desalination towers pierced cloud lines. The northern ice was nearly gone, and with its retreat came a wave of discoveries: lost coastlines, buried settlements, and once inaccessible seafloors, now exposed like wounds beneath the melting sky. But nothing disturbed the scientific world so deeply as the satellite image received by an atmospheric monitoring drone named Octant 12, launched as part of a global climate stabilization program. The image was not meant to capture oceanic data. It had been scanning upper air turbulence off the Atlantic corridor, but its cameras picked up something glimmering beneath the surface, something immense, too symmetrical to be geological. The reflectivity profile returned from the wavelet matrix scan matched no known metal. In fact, it matched no material previously recorded in Earth's mineral database. The object was shaped like an obelisk but not vertical. It lay flat against the ocean floor, nearly 2 kilometers across. Its edges tapering like the spokes of a wheel or a compass rose half buried in sediment. And at the center, just visible through the layered currents, was a void darker than shadow. Pulsing. The coordinates placed it within 50 nautical miles of the spire Eliza had once approached, but no one knew it existed. Or perhaps no one had been permitted to see it until now. The discovery set off a chain of events that bypassed governments entirely. A new vessel was constructed in secret, not funded by any single nation, but by a consortium of entities long working in the shadows of what had once been called the Threshold Initiative. Now, they had a new name, CUSTODES. The Keepers, comprised of exobiologists, the last surviving members of Lemurian, historians of non-human linguistics, and a growing sect of ocean dreamers, individuals with inexplicable memories of cliffs and waves and tower songs. They could not have known the custodies were formed not to explore, but to protect, to mediate, to witness, to now, to answer. The ship was christened the Numina, its hull made from a polymer that could withstand the crushing black of the Hadal Zone. No flags, no transponders. Its mission profile classified under every known designation, even as it moved quietly across the globe, collecting its crew. Among them was a girl named Annika Sol, 21 years old, raised in Nuuk, Greenland. Annika was the daughter of a glaciologist and a translator. She had never seen the Atlantic open water until her 12th birthday, but she had dreams. Always the same. A black tower rising in violet light. A ring of voices without tongues. A single woman's name whispered over and over by the C. Rose. She had no idea who the woman was. She had never seen the movie, never studied the ship. But when she stumbled across an archived transcript from Eliza Wren's final lecture, long since removed from digital circulation, something inside her cracked open. The glyphs matched the patterns in her sketches. The resonance frequencies matched the tones she hummed as a child. And in a journal she kept from age 8 onward, she had drawn a page filled with spirals, perfectly matching the ones carved around the spire, first recorded in 2025. When the custodies found her, they did not question her ability. They simply asked, "Have you heard the breath?" And she had. The Numina launched under veil of night from a private shipyard in Dakar. It moved swiftly, silently, into the Atlantic, reaching the designated coordinates in less than a week. The ocean above the anomaly was eerily calm. No swells, no storms, just a silence that stretched from sky to floor as the ship deployed its descent pod. Agia Tuanica climbed inside, alongside 3 others. Dr. Sahil Van, neurolinguist and former monk, Lisa Hong, marine humanicist, and Malik Ruan, subpilot with over 30 trench descents to his name. But none of them had been chosen for experience. They had been chosen because they had all seen the glyphs before they ever knew. They existed. They were the next witnesses. The descent began. Just after midnight, pressure increased, temperatures dropped, and light abandoned them. But as they neared 11,000 meters, the sensors began to register impossible data. The water was warmer here, and vibrating not with tectonic tension, but with sound low harmonic, like the world's oldest cello, playing through the bones of the ocean. Annika placed her palm to the interior hull. "She's singing," she said softly. None of them laughed. Below them, the structure came into view. Far larger than the spire, it sprawled across the ocean floor, like a sunken cathedral. The central void pulsed with a rhythm that synchronized with their own hearts. Biofeedback monitors showed their heart rates adjusting to the signal. Then the pod stopped, not mechanically. It was held. They drifted forward slowly, suspended in a field that nullified thrust. On the exterior cameras, the glyphs began to glow. First violet, then blue, then white, then open. That is the only word Annika could later find for what happened next. Not light, not vision, not hallucination, but a kind of opening of thought, of self. Their minds expanded outward, like ink in water. Thoughts no longer separate, but woven. They saw the ocean as it had once been. Silent, warm, full of giants that moved like drifting cathedrals. They saw a world before man. When the spire was one of many, they saw the decision long ago to sink, to sleep, to bury thought beneath salt. Not out of fear, but mercy. And then they saw her, Rose Dot, or something that had become her. Not flesh, not ghost, but imprint. A memory alive within the signal, preserved by the tower. Her face shimmered in the dark, not aged but eternal, mouth parted in a smile of sadness and wonder. "You came back," she said. And Annika, weeping without knowing why, nodded. "We heard you," she whispered. And the tower replied, with memory, with fire, with story. The pod drifted forward once more, and settled on a platform shaped like a ring, ancient and smooth. The final pulse of light enveloped them, and each of the 4 crew members lost consciousness not into darkness, but into dream. And in that dream they were on a ship, the Titanic, but not sinking. Sailing forward, not alone. Surrounded on below, something moved not to devour, but to guide. The sea itself as cradle, as mother. As archive. They awoke 43 minutes later. The pod had returned to the surface on its own. No data had been transmitted during the blackout. The Numina systems had temporarily shut down. Uncorrupted but silenced, Annika stepped out first. Her eyes were changed. Darker, deeper. She spoke only one phrase for the next 48 hours. "We are not alone. We never were." Each of them carried a fragment. Now, a shard of that tower's truth. A map not made of lines, but of frequencies and instinct. The custodies did not record it digitally. They wrote it in ink, in symbology, in resonance. And then they waited. For the next dreamer, for the next ripple, for the next breath, beneath the waves. Because Titanic had not simply survived. She had heard the song, and carried it forward. In hull, in heart, in witness, so that when the sea remembered, someone somewhere would be ready to listen. And now, they were. In the early years of the 22nd century, the world began to fracture not with war, nor with famine, but with a quiet division of belief. The custodies, once a clandestine order, scattered among researchers, artists, and dreamers, had grown, slowly, organically. Their numbers included not just scientists, but pilots who refused to fly over certain ocean coordinates, children born with recurring visions of spiral patterns and rising towers, and philosophers who claimed truth was no longer a linear thing but circular, like the rings carved into the sea's deepest stones. Among them, Annika's soul had become something more than human, or rather, something deeply human, in a way that had been forgotten. She rarely spoke publicly. When she did, her words carried the weight of someone who had lived many lives. She never denied her voyage in the Agia II, never claimed to be a prophet. She always said the same thing: "I saw something that remembers." And that became the foundation of a movement. The memory tide. It came to be called a quiet revolution of consciousness, anchored not to faith but to recollection. People all over the world began reporting similar dreams. Water lit from within, structures beneath the surface, music with no instrument, language that came as emotion. Artists began to paint in spirals without understanding why. Children hummed low harmonic tones that caused birds to scatter. Instruments recorded infrasonic pulses identical to those first detected by Eliza Wren in 2025. regular intervals from multiple ocean locations. Simultaneously, they were not alone anymore. The ocean had opened its eyes, but not to all. In the centers of power, where control mattered more than comprehension, alarms spread. The United Oceanic Council declared a series of new security zones across the Atlantic, deploying unmanned drones to intercept any vessel that approached the Mars 17 corridor. Surveillance increased, several vessels vanished. The custodies, by then spread across 6 continents, went deeper underground. They encrypted their writings, shared stories only orally, returned to paper, ink, and carved stone. And all the while, they waited. Then, one morning in the year 2114, every global tide sensor recorded a synchronized rise in sea level 13 centimeters across every oceanic basin. No storms, no seismic triggers, just a swelling, like breath drawn deep into lungs. 3 hours later, a pulse was recorded. Not random, not natural. A message. It originated simultaneously from 5 sites, each one previously identified by the custodies as minor nodes, smaller anomalies orbiting the main spire discovered by Titanic, then confirmed by Eliza Wren, and finally visited by Annika. The pulse matched no language, but its harmonic intervals were mathematically identical to the spacing of the glyphs found around the tower, and the intervals formed a pattern, a map. Not of land or sea, but of memory. Annika, then in her 80s but as lucid as ever, gathered with 6 of her closest companions in the archive of Witness, now housed in a labyrinthine salt vault beneath the Nova Scotia coastline. There, surrounded by spiraled carvings and hand-drawn charts stretching back to 1912, she laid out the data. There were 7 locations, each tied not to geography, but to human history. The sites corresponded with events that had been witnessed and recorded as anomalies long before technology could interpret them. The ancient well of Enceladus in Sicily, the boiling pool of El Tatio in Chile, the drowned cave near Bimini in the Bahamas, each a place where people had once described lights beneath water, voices from stone, or towers that rose for a night and were gone by morning. Titanic, it seemed, had not been the first, only the loudest. And now, the sea wanted more. It did not want worship, it wanted stories. The ocean, as Annika often said, was not a void. It was an archive, a mind made of pressure, time, and remembrance. And now it was listening. The custodies dispatched 7 vessels, each small, each unarmed, each crewed by 3 witness seas people who had heard the breath in dreams, or seen spirals in sand, or felt the pulse in the bones behind their ears. Annika did not go. Her time, she said, had passed. She was no longer a bearer. She was the bridge, and bridges did not walk. They stood. One of the vessels, the Ostara, reached the Caribbean site first. There in a trench once believed to be an unremarkable subduction zone. The ocean floor opened. Not violently, softly, as if peeling back a page. Beneath was a corridor stone, etched, ancient, filled with bioluminescence that formed a language of motion and wave. The crew of the Ostara did not descend. They sent only a signal. We are here. And the trench answered. With memory. Thousands of years of it poured into their minds in an instant. Civilizations long drowned, not by cataclysm, but by invitation. Peoples who had been called beneath, not lost, but chosen. They had not disappeared. They had transformed. Into what? No one could say. But their thoughts remained, suspended in sea like prayers made of salt. Each of the 7 vessels reported similar findings. And at the center of it, all, unshaken, unchanged, was the site first touched by Titanic. The spire. It had grown. Not in size, but in presence. It could now be seen from space, slight, faint, but visible. A ripple in the water that glowed not with light, but with memory. When ships passed near there, compasses trembled. When satellites flew above, their cameras distorted, as though refusing to see too clearly. Yet those who dreamt, they saw it vividly. The glyphs now changed constantly, visible in shallow waters far from the original site, no longer just on stone, but in coral formations, in tidal sand lines, in the migratory patterns of sea creatures, who swam in spirals for no apparent reason. Something was coming, or perhaps something was returning. Annika's last act, months before her death, was to write a final letter, not to the custodies, not to any government, but to the world. She wrote, "Once, a ship dared the edge of what we knew. It carried the arrogant and the broken, the lost and the hungry. It carried a woman who saw, and a man who listened. And it was spared not, because it was worthy, but because it bore witness. Because it dared to look into the breath beneath the waves and not flinch. Now, the sea is asking again, are you willing to remember? She passed in her sleep beneath the salt vault, and the tide rose. One final time, not destructively, not cruelly, but with intention, as if the sea were leaning closer, as if the archive had decided it was time to be read again, as if the deep had chosen its next vessel. And perhaps it had, because one morning, on the shores of Nova Scotia, a child was found asleep in the surf. Breathing. Alive. Unharmed. In her tiny hand, she clutched a shard of metal, curved, etched with spirals, unmistakably part of Titanic's hull. She could not yet speak, but when they lifted her, she began to hum a low, soft melody, the song of the tower, the same one Rose had once whispered to Jack, in a dream of water and fire. And those who heard it wept not from fear, but from understanding. Titanic had never sunk. It had descended, and in doing so, opened a door, and now the world stood before it, ready. In the year 2137, the Atlantic grew quiet, not still but reverent, as if every tide knew something sacred was approaching. The coasts of 5 continents recorded tides that rose and fell in perfect symmetry. Fishermen, long skeptical of myth or prophecy, began speaking of patterns in the current, of fish that swam in circles, of a sense of waiting that stretched from port to reef. Weather satellites detected repeating fog spirals across regions that had never known mist. Entire flocks of seabirds shifted migration paths, tracing ancient symbols invisible to human eyes but embedded in the air like invisible glyphs. And deep beneath the waterline, where the pressure was great enough to shatter metal and the light had not touched for 1,000,000 years, the spire pulsed once more. This time, it did not sing. It called no longer with tones or harmonic echoes, but with intention. And the world answered. The now numbering in the thousands across the planet, activated the final phase of the witness protocol, not to protect the site, not to claim it, but to prepare the world for communion. They opened archives, long-kept secret fragments of Elisa Wren's translations, recovered sketches from Rose's journals, and even partial reconstructions of the harmonic patterns encoded in Jack Dawson's last drawings. Yes, Jack, though his body had never been found, and his name never appeared again in any known registry, certain elements of his story lingered. A signature discovered on a weathered scrap of driftwood, decades after Titanic's voyage. A figure in a charcoal sketch, dated 1913, unmistakably his likeness, found in an abandoned gallery in Marseille. And once, a letter, undated, unsigned, but written in a hand that matched Rose's. He remembers, in light now, that was all it said. And so, the world prepared. They did not know what would come. They only knew that it would be a return, not of boding, but of memory. A flood of understanding, a wave of remembering so vast that it would alter the very shape of humanity's place in the world. The final expedition launched, not from a port, but from a floating platform above the spire itself. It had grown invisible now, even from aerial photography. Ships were no longer needed. The ocean had begun to rise around it, as if lifting it closer to the sky. Aboard the vessel Erin, named for the goddess of peace, stood a woman not yet 20, her skin freckled from the sun and her eyes deep as the tide. Her name was Isla, the child once found asleep on Nova Scotia's shores. She remembered nothing of that day, or of her first 7 years, but from the moment she could speak, she spoke only of the ocean. She painted waves she had never seen, and at night she hummed the melody that had once passed from Rose to Jack, from the tower to Annika, from the dream to the waking. The melody had no name. It did not need one. It was the memory of the sea itself. And now, Isla stood at the edge of its breath. With her aboard, the Irene were representatives of every nation, every people, every language. Not politicians, not soldiers, but dreamers, rememberers, poets and deep-sea divers, monks and linguists, mothers and children. Each of them had seen the glyphs. Each of them had heard the call. As they drifted above the now revealed structure, an immense, ringed formation that stretched 5 kilometers across the ocean floor, something rose. Not from the deep, from within them, a memory shared all at once. They saw it, the moment the Titanic reached the edge, not an iceberg, a gateway. The sea had opened not with violence, but with grace. The ship had passed over a seam in the world, a place where memory had thinned to a breath, and something ancient had looked up and asked, "Are you ready?" They saw Jack and Rose standing at the bow, wind in their hair, no fear in their hearts. They saw the ship not sink, but shift. Tilt not into tragedy, but into wonder. They saw it bathed in light beneath the waves. Its iron no longer heavy, its steel no longer cold, but radiant with understanding. They saw every soul aboard given a choice, and many said, yes. Isla wept, not because it was sad, but because it was true. The ship had become the first vessel of witness, the first to carry human memory into the mind of the sea and return, not with proof, but with transformation. Its myth had become its message, its story, a signal dot. And now Isla and the others were the next chapter. The Arene hovered still above the spire, which no longer glowed, but shimmered. The symbols on its surface rotated slowly, each one matching the resonance of a different human voice. When Isla stepped to the edge of the deck and placed her hand in the water, the sea did not ripple. It opened beneath the surface. A tower of light rose. Not stone, not metal, memory made visible. A cascade of images. Titanic, Rose, Jack, Eliza, Daniel, Annika, all those who had touched the threshold spun in slow harmony within the core of the tower. Each life a thread in the fabric of a new understanding. Isla closed her eyes. The voice that spoke was not hers, and yet it came from her throat. We are ready to remember. The tower responded, not in words, but in feeling, warmth, forgiveness, reunion, and then the sea sang. Every coast heard it, every heart felt it. The melody passed through continents, echoed in mountains, mirrored in bird calls, painted in the spiral of distant galaxies. It was a story told not in language, but in resonance. The story of a ship, of a boy who sketched life from nothing, of a girl who refused to be trapped by her name, of a sea that had always been alive, and a world that finally listened. The spire dimmed, the light faded, but the memory remained. Isla stepped back from the edge and smiled. She did not speak again. That day, she did not need to. The world had heard enough. In the years that followed, humanity changed, not with thunder, not with conquest, but with knowing. The oceans were no longer boundaries. They were libraries. The sea became a cathedral of memory, and the spire a beacon not of warning, but of welcome. New vessels set sail not to conquer, but to learn, not to mine, but to sing. They carried no weapons, only stories, and above the former resting place of Titanic, now renamed Saul's Passage, there floated a single buoy that played a low, harmonic tone every hour, drifting gently with the tide, a reminder that once a ship dared the edge of the unknown, and did not fall, but rose, into memory, into myth. Into the heart of the sea, where all stories begin, and none are truly lost, only waiting to be heard.